Dear students, I am going to teach class 9 biology and the topic is pollination and fertilization. At first, you just go through the syllabus. Pollination, self-pollination and cross-pollination. What will you have to learn actually in this chapter? Definition of pollination, then types of pollination, that is self-pollination and cross-pollination. Then advantages and disadvantages of self and cross-pollination, then agents of pollination and fertilization. At first, what is pollination? Pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of a flower is called pollination. Now, pollination can happen in three ways. That means transfer of pollen grain can be occurred from a flower to the stigma of the same flower. This is called autogamy. When the pollen grains transfer from the anther of a flower to the stigma of the same flower, that means in case of bisexual flower, it is called autogamy. Another one is when pollen grains transfer from the anther of a flower to the stigma of a flower of the same plant. That means both the flowers are remaining in the same plant. Male and female flower remaining in the same plant. That is why the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of a male flower to the stigma of a female flower of the same plant. It is called geitonogamy. These two are included in self-pollination. That means when will you have to give the definition of self-pollination, these two answers will be there. Now allogamy, it is actually cross-pollination, in which pollen grains are transferred from the anther of a flower to the stigma of a flower of another plant of same species. Once again I am repeating, you just go through the definition given here. Transfer of pollen grain from the anther of a flower to the stigma of flower of another plant of the same species. This is called allogamy, and it is actually the definition of cross-pollination. Now go through self-pollination. Definition of self-pollination, it is also given. I have already told you. It is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of a flower to the stigma of the same flower or another flower of the same plant. So this is called self-pollination. Now, what is cross-pollination? Cross-pollination, it is the transfer of pollen grain from the anther of a flower of one plant to the stigma of a flower of another plant of the same species. This is called cross-pollination. I have already discussed in allogamy. Now we are going to the next point, that is advantages and disadvantages of self and cross-pollination. At first we will learn about the advantages of self-pollination, disadvantages of self-pollination. Advantages of self-pollination, it ensures pollination. That means pollination is it is sure that pollination will be occurred, because in the same flower pollen grains are produced and eggs are also remaining there. That means both male and female female parts are remaining in the same flower. That is why it is sure that the pollination will be occurred. Number 2, avoids wastage of pollen grains. Though the pollen grains need not to move, that is why there is no wastage of pollen grains. Number 3, preserves the parental characters. In self-pollination, the offsprings are having the same characteristics like their parents. That is why here parental characters are preserved. Then phone number, flowers need not to produce nectar and scent, and they need not to be showy. In case of cross pollination, the flowers are showy and produce nectar and scent, I mean perfumed or nice smell to attract the agents, especially the insects. So the insects will move from one flower to another flower, in which the flower attracts the agent, and I mean insects. That is why in cross pollination all these characteristics are to be in the flower, but in case of self pollination there is no need to produce nectar, there is no need to produce nice smell, or there is no need to be the flower showy. Now agents are not required. That means in the same flower male part and female parts are remaining. That is why there is no need of external agent. So agents are not required. These are some of the advantages of self-pollination. Some more are given in the book. You just go through. It's very easy. You can easily understand. Now disadvantages of self-pollination. That means what are the demerits? What are the disadvantages of self-pollination? A continuation of self-pollination results the weaker progeny. That means if the process of self-pollination is occurred continuously for a long time, the offsprings will be weaker, I mean lower quality. New species and varieties of plants are not produced. There is no chance of the production of new species or varieties, I mean variations are not occurred in case of self-pollination. Now advantages of cross-pollination: it results healthier and strong offsprings. The offsprings are healthier and strong. Then variation, because it occurs in between two plants of same species. That is why there is a chance of variation. Variation actually brings new species. So variation and new varieties with useful characters are produced. Then seeds have better germinating capacity. Seeds, you know that germination of seed, it is a better option for the production of a plant. Now large number of viable seeds are produced. So these are the advantages of cross pollination. Now I am going to discuss about disadvantages of cross pollination. Pollination is uncertain because the pollen grains need to move from one flower, from the flower of a plant to the flower of another plant. That is why it is not sure when the pollen grains will be transferred, then the pollination can be occurred. So here the pollination is uncertain. Then large amount of pollen grains have to be produced because there is a chance of wastage of pollen grains. That is why large amount of pollen grains have to be produced. Plants have to depend on external agents for pollination. Without external agent, pollen grains will not be transferred from one plant to another plant. That is why in case of cross pollination, external agents are required. Now I am going to discuss about nature favors cross pollination or adaptations for cross pollination. Some plants are having having some characteristics. Some plants are having some characteristics in such a way so that self-pollination is not possible for those plants. Only they are having only one option of cross-pollination. For example, number one, unisexuality. That means if the plant is unisexual, then the pollination can be occurred only by cross-pollination. There is no chance of self-pollination, as the plant or the flower contain only one reproductive part, either stamen or carpel. That is why the flowers are